We're live now.
Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever your time zones are. My name is Adil Malik. I'm a Globe Fellow in the Economies of Muslim Societies at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies and an Associate Professor in Development Economics at the University of Oxford. A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Economic Research Forum in Cairo. This is the 27th Annual Conference of the ERF, and it's the first panel session on economic growth. We have three very interesting papers today in this session, and we will start with the first one, which is on capital flight and exchange rate in resource-rich MENA countries. But before I invite our speaker for this session, I have a few administrative announcements to make, following which I will provide a very brief bio for these speakers. Today's session will involve around 10 to 15 minute presentation by each presenter. And these presentations will be followed by my overall comments. And then that will open the floor for discussion. If you want to ask any question, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom right of the Zoom screen and type in your question. We'll relay the question towards the end of the session. And of course, everyone can see those questions as they drip in. Additionally, if you want to ask your question in person, personally, yourself, please click the raise hand button again at the bottom of the screen. And I will invite you to present your question or comment. So without further ado, let's get started. The first paper is on capital flight. It's going to be presented by Dr. Yasmin Yalta, who's a professor at the Department of Economics at Hacettepe University in Turkey. She has a PhD from Fordham University in the United States, has published in several journals, and also the author of two best-selling books, textbooks in economics in Turkey. Over to you, Yasmin, a very warm welcome. Could I also request that all the participants and presenters, other than the one who's presenting, just mute themselves so that there's no echo in this. And any mobile phones could also be turned to silent mode. So without further ado, I'm going to mute my mic and hand it over to Yasmin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is nice to see you again, although we cannot meet face-to-face this year. Today I am going to present our co-authored paper on capital flight and real exchange rate in resource-scarce MENA countries. I will begin with the motivation, contribution of the study. I will briefly talk about the literature. Then I will explain the data sources and the empirical methodology we follow. I will conclude with main empirical findings and policy implications. Capital flight is an important issue because it undermines growth efforts in many developing countries. The estimates of capital flight in many countries demonstrate that large amounts of capital flight flee to the developed countries. If these funds could be held at home, they could be utilized to increase investment, to undertake structural reforms, to achieve higher growth rates. Therefore, we believe that it's an important research question to analyze, especially for MENA countries. When we look at the literature, we see that there are a few papers on the issue. Almanzor provides the first estimates and finds that both macroeconomic and political factors play an important role on capital flight. Al-Fayoumi investigates the determinants of capital flight for MENA countries using a panel data methodology. Minif et al. Explore the determinants of capital flight for Tunisia and find that institutional factors are important in affecting capital flight. In a recent paper, Heydari and Jariani investigate the determinants of capital flight for some MENA countries using panel data analysis. Yassen et al. Considered 5 MENA countries, again using panel GMM analysis. Against this background, we aim to contribute to the literature in the following ways. First of all, most of the studies in the literature use panel data analysis. Therefore, we want to contribute to the literature by using a time series analysis so that we can provide further insights to the determinants of capital flight by analyzing the role of different country characteristics. We also use both linear and non-linear co-integration methods to see if there is a co-integration between capital flight, real exchange rate, economic growth rate, inflation rate, and institutional quality in 3 MENA countries. In the existing literature, it is generally assumed that the relation between capital flight and real exchange is symmetric. Therefore, our second contribution is to analyze the relation between real exchange rate and capital flight using a non-linear ARDL method. To the best of our knowledge, there is no study analyzing the determinants of capital flight as well as the possible asymmetry between these variables for these countries. Finally, we also examined the impact of Arab Spring, whether Arab Spring had contributed to higher capital flight in MENA countries. We include 3 countries in our analysis: Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. We use data for the period between 1975 and 2019. To measure capital flight, we use the World Bank's residual method. According to this method, capital flight is calculated as the discrepancy between the sources and uses of capital flight. Therefore, if estimated capital flight is positive, it means that there is capital flight in the country. Our estimates show that capital flight exhibited large fluctuations in all 3 countries. Capital flight was a major problem in Egypt, especially during early 1980s. Later, Egypt experienced capital repatriation, but since Arab Spring, there was an increase in capital flight. The same is also true for Morocco. There has been an increase in the amount of capital flight since Arab Spring. Compared to Egypt and Morocco, we see that capital flight seems to be a severe problem for Tunisia because in most of the sample period, there was capital flight. As for data and data sources, we use real GDP growth rate, inflation rate, institutional quality, and real exchange rates based on the literature. The literature emphasizes the role of these factors as important determinants of capital flight. Therefore, real exchange rate is expected to reduce capital flight. Institutional quality is expected to reduce capital flight. Because we want to analyze the effect of Arab Spring and capital flight, we construct a dummy variable which takes a value of 1 after 2011, 0 otherwise. The data for calculating capital flight, real GDP growth rate, and inflation rate are taken from World Development Indicators. Real exchange rate data is obtained from a Bruegel database, and institutional quality variable is obtained from Polity4 database. We are going to use ARDL methodology proposed by Pesseran and non-linear ARDL methodology proposed by Shin. As you know, ARDL methodology has several advantages. It can be used in the cases of I0 and I1. And also it is known to be robust even for small sample sizes. And this is the representation according to Pesseran's ARDL model. We test whether the lagged levels of variables had a significant effect on dependent variable. And we do this by using NF test. So if the computed statistics exceeds the upper bounds, it means that the null hypothesis is rejected, indicating co-integration among the variables. Then we undertake a non-linear ARDL approach because we want to distinguish between increases and decreases in real exchange rate. So whether the depreciations or appreciations have an effect on capital flight is our research question here. For this purpose, we use Shin's methodology, and we distinguish between real exchange rate appreciation and depreciation. And these are defined as partial sum of negative and positive changes as follows. Now I will briefly talk about our empirical findings. First of all, as usual, we begin with unit root testing because the variables should not be I2 in ARDL methodology. After confirming that these variables are not I2, we proceed with testing co-integration among the variables. Here we see the co-integration results for all countries, for all of 3 countries. We see that there is a co-integration among the variables. We also present long-run and short-run estimates. Here we see the long-run coefficients. We see that in Egypt, inflation has a negative effect on capital flight. In Morocco, we see that it has a positive effect. In Tunisia, we see that real exchange rate has a significant and positive effect. And in all 3 countries, we see that Arab Spring has a statistically significant effect. As for the error correction representation, these are the results. Actually, the results are similar to the long-run estimates. For Egypt, we see that real exchange rate has a positive effect on capital flight. For Morocco, we see that lagged value of growth rate has a significant effect, and inflation rate has a significant effect. For Tunisia, we see that institutional quality is negatively related with capital flight. Therefore, increases in institutional quality leads to a reduction in capital flight. Also, for Tunisia, lagged capital flight is significant. This is also in line with the literature because lagged capital flight is expected to increase capital flight in later periods. Again, Arab Spring has a statistically significant effect. We also employ certain tests. We employ autocorrelation tests. We also test for the stability of the parameters. And we see that there is no autocorrelation and parameters are stable. After finding the existence of linear co-integration, we proceed with non-linear co-integration. Again, we use F statistics, and we show that even if we use non-linear ARDL methodology, there is co-integration among the variables for these 3 countries. But in non-linear ARDL methodology, we want to distinguish between increases and decreases in real exchange rate. Therefore, we also talk about the effect of these separate variables on capital flight. Here we see the long-run coefficients. This time, we see that for Egypt and for Tunisia, decreases in real exchange rate has a significant effect in capital flight. It means that real exchange depreciation leads to more capital flight in these two countries. And this is the error correction representation using non-linear ARTL model. Again, for the real exchange rate variable, we see a similar effect for Egypt. We see that decreases in real exchange rate is significant. Moreover, we see that for Tunisia, lagged capital flight is still significant. An institutional quality variable is significant. An improvement in institutional quality reduces capital flight. We also see that in Tunisia, real exchange rate variable is significant, indicating that decreases in real exchange rate leads to more capital flight by increasing uncertainty in the economy. And again, we undertake autocorrelation test and parameter stability test. In order to undertake a non-linear analysis, the second step is using Volt test. We also apply Volt test. And according to the results of the Volt test, we see that short-run asymmetry is rejected for Morocco and Tunisia. It is only accepted for Egypt. Therefore, for Egypt, there is short-run asymmetry between capital flight and real exchange rate.
Just 3 minutes, please.
Therefore, our results provide evidence for both linear and non-linear co-integration. The findings indicate that different factors play a role on capital flight. For example, real GDP growth rate is important for Morocco. Lagged values of capital flight and institutional quality is important for Tunisia. For Egypt, real exchange rate is the main factor. Therefore, these have important policy implications. In Morocco, the policymakers should give emphasis to improve macroeconomic environment. And in Tunisia, the focus needs to be on institutional quality. And in Egypt, the focus should be monetary policy and exchange rate policy. Thank you for listening. So your comments are welcome.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. We now can move to the next presenter, who will speak to us about Jordan, economic entrenchment and growth impediments in Jordan. The paper is going to be presented by Professor Adel Bino. Professor Adel has a PhD in economics from the University of New Orleans in Louisiana in the United States, and has been an associate professor of finance at the University of Jordan. He's a well-known researcher, has published widely and has consulted widely with international organizations. And today he's going to tell us a bit about corporate finance, political connections, ownership structures in Jordan, a very important topic on which we don't have enough prior work. So Professor Adel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the ERF for this great opportunity, despite the tough times that we are all going through. I would like to also thank the discussant and the attendees. And your questions and notes will definitely certainly are welcome and appreciated. This is a paper that's basically a country-specific evidence on the economic entrenchment and capital and growth impediments in Jordan. Just to give you some observations as far as what motivated the idea of this paper, In fact, there are several instances and observations that has motivated the idea of this paper. As you could see in these two graphs, first of all, is the performance of the corporations, public corporations in Jordan, especially the ones that are listed on the Amman Stock Exchange. So these are the largest corporations, and these are the non-financial corporations that include both manufacturing and services corporations. So if you look at the returns that these corporations have been making since 2004 up to 2017, you would see a clear decline and sharp decline, in fact, in both in the return on assets and return on equity since 2004, which has decreased from about 7% in 2004 to less than 2% in 2017. So you're talking about something like more than a 5% of decrease in both return on assets and return on equity. In fact, a more striking observation is the sharp decrease in the measures of the corporate growth, whether the growth was measured in terms of growth in assets or growth in sales. In fact, the growth in assets has decreased from more than 15% in 2004 to less than to more than negative 10% negative growth in 2017. So a clear question here is that what is it that is impeding the growth in a country like Jordan? Now, the main reason that I'm proposing in this paper is economic entrenchment. This is a concept that has been coined by Mork et al. In 2005, and another paper. They have one more paper in 2000 where they started this concept of economic entrenchment that they define as a stable, self-sustaining, stable equilibrium that seems, I'm quoting here, economic entrenchment is a self-sustaining, stable equilibrium that seems to characterize some, but not all, oligarchic capitalist economies. The stark divergence between high and low income economies appears to result from the latter becoming trapped in weak property rights regimes characterized by economic entrenchment. More specifically,
Adil, can I interrupt? A lot of people, including myself, can't fully see your screen. It's not visible. There's a black dot. So can you unshare the screen and share again? Maybe it improves.
What?
So if you could unshare your screen.
Is it better now?
No. There's a black mark. So now if you could share again, and let's see if it works.
Now?
Unfortunately, there's a black we can see a black box on the right.
Okay.
So
hold on.
Anyway, let's try. If not, then we'll just listen to you as we go along.
How is it now?
We can still see a black bar on the right. Here, okay. I can see the black.
Okay, hold on. I know. And now?
Yes, it's gone.
Okay. I'm sorry. It's my fault. I'm sorry.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Okay. So again, the reason that I'm proposing here for the negative growth that is taking place, that has been taking place, in fact, for the last several years in Jordan, is economic entrenchment. This is a concept that has been coined by Mork et al. In 2005. More specifically, what is meant by economic entrenchment is a phenomenon where the public corporations are controlled by few shareholders with little real capital invested, which permits agency problems like expropriating minority shareholders' rights and resource misallocation. Thus, it leads to corporate governance problems that are important on the macro level and can affect the economic growth. The determinants, basically, of this economic entrenchment, Mork et al. They in fact determine some determinants on the macro level that include political reasons, legal reasons, social reasons, and some cultural reasons. Some of the reasons that they propose, things that have to do with the democracy, whether or not the country is a democratic country or not, whether or not the press is free, whether the judiciary system of the country is efficient or not. So these determinants on the macro level, in fact, are the ones that lead to causes of economic entrenchment on the micro level. Two main causes are proposed in the literature as to why and how a country suffers economic entrenchment. The first one is, in fact, indirect control ownership. Indirect control ownerships happen when shareholders own public corporations through some other private corporation or through from other public corporations. This kind of ownership of corporations is, in fact, is known as a pyramid structure of corporate ownership. These indirect control ownerships are, in fact, they amplify and magnify the political power of the corporate insiders, and the corporate insiders becoming politically connected. The literature shows that it leads to them being or becoming or lobbying against the government so that they can get some preferential treatment from the government, whether it was in terms of taxes or it was in terms of protection against the competition and access to markets that may not be available to other corporations. The second cause is basically the direct political connection of corporate insiders. Again, when corporate insiders are politically connected, or when the firm's executives are, in fact, are politically connected, then they can extract some government procurement transactions and probably at manipulated prices. So you have determinants of economic entrenchment on the macro level that translate or become reasons or causes of economic entrenchment on the micro level. Therefore, these are the two main causes or the ways that I measure the political connection on the corporate level. The previous research on economic entrenchment, in fact, can be classified into research that looks at the cross-country or provides some cross-country evidence and some country-specific evidence. The cross-country evidence, in fact, shows that entrenched corporate control does, in fact, lead to slow growth. Firms or countries that are more economically entrenched, they suffer slow and lower growth. And the pyramid and countries where the corporations are owned via a pyramid structure, they are more able to maybe exert some political influence on the government, and therefore maybe get some preferential treatments from the government itself. The research also shows that the political connections are more prevalent, in fact, in large corporations where countries that are highly corrupt and the ones that impose restrictions on foreign investment. The country-specific evidence, however, most of the country-specific evidence comes basically from Malaysia and from Indonesia. And the research, in fact, shows that firms in countries that are economically entrenched are less risky, and that their cost of equity, in fact, as Bubakri shows, their cost of equity is also lower as a result of them being less risky. The evidence that comes from Indonesia, for example, finds that stock prices of firms behave differently. In fact, they are more the firms that were more connected to Suharto, they were more affected. They were also found more likely to have they're less likely, in fact, less likely to have publicly traded foreign securities that are traded outside the country itself. They were also found to be larger corporations and more profitable. They were also found to have a lower leverage, and the explanation for that might be is that the corporate insiders, especially those who are politically connected, avoiding scrutiny from the financial institutions in general and from the banks in particular. To conduct this research, in fact, I chose to do this research in Jordan. And the question is, why Jordan? There are several reasons for that. First of all, there is no country-specific evidence. I could not find much research on political connections or on the way that corporations are controlled and owned in the MENA region in general, or a country-specific evidence for the MENA countries, except maybe for 2 or 3 papers. One of these papers is by Kubenik, who finds that politically connected firms in Jordan and Morocco are subject to lighter regulations and are protected against competition. And this would be
Adil, Professor Adil, you have about 5-6 minutes, so if you could just
all right.
Thank you.
So Kubenik finds that in Jordan and Morocco, the politically connected firms they face lighter regulations and they are protected against competition. Simon 2018 finds that Jordan has the largest number of director interlocks, director ownership ties, and family groups. And I myself, I have the previous research on the corporate ownership structure in Jordan, and I do find that most of the corporations in Jordan are in fact have a very concentrated ownership structures. The corporate insiders are mainly families, wealthy families, who use their power not only as shareholders, but also as executives of the firm. Now, the specification that I used to test for this is in a panel data set. And I have 2 main measures, in fact. One is the ownership structure of the firm. But what makes this paper different from the previous ones is that I use as a measure of the ownership concentration, not only the direct ownership, but also the indirect ownership of the corporation. While for the political connection, I use a previous research, or I follow, in fact, the previous research. In measuring the political connection of the firm, I ask whether or not one or more of the largest shareholders of the firm or its top executives was a minister or maybe some highly ranked government official. So corporations were one or more of its executives or the shareholders, especially large shareholders, was in fact a minister or was a highly ranked government official, then it is a dummy variable that is equal to 1 and 0 otherwise. The results that I get so far, in fact, this is still a very preliminary version of the paper, but my initial results show that connected firms in Jordan do, in fact, invest less in assets. So the economic entrenchment and the corporate governance mechanism seems to play a major role in slowing down the growth of the corporations. I also do find that these politically connected firms, they perform less. Their performance is, in fact, sometimes much worse than the performance of non-connected firms. I also find that these politically connected firms, they rely less on borrowed money, which is consistent with the previous research that says that these corporate insiders, they try to avoid the scrutiny that comes from the financial institutions in general and from banks in particular. That's why they avoid borrowing money. So therefore, this is simply my results. The financial crisis does not seem to has affected much at this point, although I find some significant statistically different results before and after the financial crisis. In fact, Jordan was not really affected by the financial crisis per se as much as it was affected by the hike in the global inflation, because Jordan uses a fixed exchange rate system, and that makes Jordan very susceptible to whatever happens in the countries where we get our imports, especially like the United States and Europe. So therefore, the impact of the financial crisis was, in fact, basically the impact of high inflation or the hike in the global inflation rate. I do recognize that there are several some drawbacks or some of the things that I should take care of. One of them is the measure that I'm using as far as the asset growth. The one that I used in this paper is the change in the total assets of the firm. I'm going to use also, I also tried the net assets or the fixed assets of the firm, because that would be more direct measure of the firm's growth. And I also need to deal with some possibility of endogeneity of ownership structure, meaning maybe it's not because this firm is owned in this particular way, that's why it performs better or worse. Maybe it is because the firm is expected to perform better. That's why these shareholders decided to own more of that firm. The kind of the econometrics I use, in fact, I use both the static and as well as the dynamic panel analysis, including the bias corrected fixed effects and the bundle and bond dynamic panel estimations. So thank you for listening. And again, thanks to ERF, your comments and your questions are certainly welcome. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Adil. For those who are attending this session, may I draw your attention to the fact that the complete paper of Professor Adil and in fact other presenters are available on the ERF website. So for example, Professor Adil did not show us his empirical results, he just summarized them. The detailed empirical results are part of his paper. The tables are appended towards the end. So if you want to look at the specifics of those coefficients and the magnitude of the effects and stuff, those are available in his paper. So let's proceed to our final presentation today by Professor Saeed Tajrishti, and this is on Iran. He's going to present us, the broader externalities of the public housing projects in Iran, using the case of the MENA project in Iran. Let me quickly introduce the speaker, and I have the bio in front of me. Saeed is a PhD candidate at the Sharif University in Iran. He's working on public housing and its economic impacts. And apart from his research, he's also working at the Parliament Research Center of the Islamic Republic of Iran as an economist and is part of the public economics group. He's also written a paper on the economic effects of dam construction, again, focusing on Iran. So Saeed, the floor is yours, and look forward to hearing from you. Have you unmuted yourself? Yeah, please start.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Malik, and all organizers of this conference. I'm going to present this paper that is joint with my advisor, Dr. Mohammad Vesal at Sharif University of Technology, which is about the externality of public housing projects with the evidence from a very large-scale public housing program in Iran, which is called MENA project. And this project has been started about 13 years ago, from 2007, and it's continued until now. Housing costs make up a significant portion of cost of living in developed and also developing countries. For example, more than 10% of Iranian and also American households are paying more than 50% of their income on housing. And because of that, many families, especially poor ones, find it increasingly difficult to afford their necessities. And because of that, governments intervene in low-income housing markets in most of the countries all over the world by building or providing affordable housing. This kind of intervention has some effects. For example, for the poor households that live in these housing units can live in better houses. Also, it has some macroeconomic effects. But also, this kind of intervention has some spillover effects on others. And this kind of externalities doesn't pay attention in most of the policy making in our country. Iran's government in 2007 announced a plan to subsidize construction of 2 million housing units to slow down the sharp rise in house prices. And this kind of apartments were suitable for low and middle income households. And this program was very large scale and doubled the monetary base at that time and built in most of the cities all over the country. In addition to great macro effect that this huge project has, and also in addition to its effects on low-income residents, it has some effects on the host neighborhoods, which can be evaluated by changes in neighboring property values, and that's what we are going to do in this paper. So really the question we want to answer is that what is the effect of MEH housing on nearby property values? And also, we want to answer which mechanisms are more important according to heterogeneity between cities and something like that. We have three potential mechanisms. The first mechanism is amnesty effect. Amnesty effect is something like removal of vacant lots and improvements in the community facilities. And this mechanism increases the value of surrounding houses. A countervailing mechanism is the disseminated effect. For example, concentration of low-income households and greater congestion in the neighborhood are all potential disseminated effect, which results in reduction of neighboring property values. And the second mechanism is supply effect, which in our context, because government supply a lot of housing units in each region, we should have great supply effect that reduce the property values of neighboring regions. Many studies evaluate the externality of affordable housing in developed countries. Yet, to the best of our knowledge, there is no study that evaluates the externality of public housing projects in developing countries. Because we expect in developing countries different government effectiveness, and we expect different results in developing countries. Furthermore, in our paper, we consider both supply and disseminated effect together in a very large scale project, and try to disentangle between these two effects in our paper. Also, most of studies focus on small geographic area like a neighborhood or a city. But in our paper, we focus on a large geographic area, and we focus on mostly all capitals of all provinces in Iran as a developing country. This figure shows normalized house prices in MEH postal region and non-MEH postal region. The red one is MEH neighborhood housing prices in MEH neighborhood, and the blue one is housing prices in other neighborhood. And the horizontal axis show time relative to the time of MEH project completion in each city. As you can see in this figure, before delivery of MEH units, both MEH neighborhood and other neighborhood have the same trend, and the price of houses have the same trend. But about 1 year after delivery of first MEH units, which is the red line, we can see a divergence between these two trends. This figure provides visual evidence on the negative impact of MEH housing project on their neighboring properties. We rely on a difference in difference strategy to estimate the reduced form effect of MEH housing units on nearby house prices. Intuitively, we compare the change in the price of housing units in the postal region of MEH projects to the change in the price of housing units in other postal regions at the time MEH housing units were delivered to applicants. We use this specification for our purpose. In this specification, P is price of 1 meter square of house in postal region P and month T. MEH is a dummy variable which turns on if the transaction occurs after delivery of first MEH unit and the MEH housing is located in the postal region, and 0 otherwise. X are housing specific characters like area and age of the transaction of the property. And to allow for flexible global time effects and also arbitrary time invariant differences, we add postal region fixed effect and also time fixed effect in our specification. And also, we may have correlations between city-specific trends and the timing of MEH project completion that might cause some issue for our identification. And to rule out this possibility, we add alpha city, which is city by time fixed effect. In this specification, phi is our parameter of interest and measures the differential percent change in house prices across MEH and non-MEH regions. In order to interpret this as the causal impact of MEH units on nearby properties, we need to assume that in the absence of MEH project, the trends in property values would be the same across MEH and non-MEH neighborhoods, which is our identification assumption. In this table, you can see our main regression results. In this table, column 1 to 4, column 4 to 6, we add another dummy variable, which is near, and this dummy turns on if the transaction occurs within 2 kilometers from MEH housing project and not in the MEH housing project region. In column 1 and 4, we just add postal region fixed effect and time fixed effect. In column 2 and 5, we add city by year fixed effect, and in column 3 and 6, we add city by month fixed effect. So our preferred specification is column 3 and 6, and in both of them, we can see that we see a reduction. We see an 11% reduction in the property values of MEH region, and not significant result for near region.
Just a very quick clarification question. Is your post dummy, does it vary? I mean, it differs across different housing units, right, as they come online, or is the same for everyone?
Can you repeat your question?
Yes. So is your post dummy or your time dummy, right? So the post term, is it the same for all MEH regions?
No.
Or differ according to when they become?
No, yeah. In each city, MEH housing units were delivered in different time, and so the post dummy is different in each city, and we use that in our specification for identification. So we have a rich variation in timing and also location of MEH housing projects, which justifies our reliance on a difference in difference estimation strategy. However, we try several additional specifications to make sure that our results are not driven by omitted factors. And in all of the robustness checks, the coefficient is still highly significant and in the same ballpark. For example, we allow, because MEH housing is mostly constructed in the suburbs of the cities, and because of that, we allow differential trends for suburbs from city center. And the first robustness check is that. In the second robustness check, we restrict our sample to coastal regions that are in the suburb, in the outskirts of the cities. And in the second robustness check, we allow differential trend by quartiles of average postal price in base year to control for mean reversion. Another threat that may be for our results is that maybe the reduction is because we have some MEH housing units in our transactions, and because maybe they will be with lower quality and lower price. Because of that, we do another robustness check and drop MEH housing units possible transactions with their age. For example, newly constructed building, we drop all of them and make sure that these are not MEH housing. And also, our results are robust. Also, in the final robustness check, we do a placebo MEH coastal region, and we conduct a placebo test and assign treatment status to the postal region at the furthest distance from MEH coastal region, and define MEH to be equal to 1 for the opposite suburb of the city. And that was another robustness check. And we find that coefficients are small and insignificant in this placebo test.
Yeah, please feel free to show these if you want to. Okay.
Yeah, if I have time.
If you think it's important, yeah.
If I have time, I can show them. For example, this one is our placebo test. In our placebo test, the same as our main specification, but the difference is that the MEH treatment, we assign MEH treatment to another postal region that is in opposite side of the city. And as you can see, we don't see any significant results in all of the columns. I continue, and if I have time, I can come back and show another. So far we have established a robust result that after MEH units are delivered to applicants in a postal region, we observe around 11% fall in the price of nearby properties. But as I mentioned before, two categories of mechanisms could be responsible for this negative impact. First, supply effect, and second, disseminated effect. MEH projects delivered a large number of housing units and would therefore increase housing supply, which reduced prices. Activating the supply channel was the main intention of the government, while disseminated effect is simply an undesirable and unintended channel. In order to establish that at least some of the estimated negative effect is due to the disseminated channel, we look at 4 types of heterogeneity. The first one is this. As we can see here, MEH housing projects mostly are in area category 75 and 110 meters square. We expect that because they are in this meter square, the supply effect should be larger for this category and also the less meters category. But as you can see in this picture, there is no significant difference between different area categories. And this is some sort of evidence that supply effect is not the main channel that describe these results. The second one is that this project scale of MEH in each city is different from another one. And we expect that if supply effect is the main and is the only channel, if we have in cities that project have more larger scale projects, we expect to have more negative results. But as you can see here, there is no significant. As you can see, this is MEH units percent of existing stock, which is a proxy for the size of MEH project, a scale of MEH project, and this is the MEH coefficient for that city. And this is not, there is no relation between them. The second one, we use evolution of MEH effect over time. We expect if supply effect is more important, we expect that the negative effect starts in the year that MEH units delivered, because of anticipation and because of newly constructed buildings appear in the region. But we expect that disseminated effect comes later, because residents of that units come later to that region, and congestion and something like that are disseminated show later. And as you can see here, in the first 2 years, in the first 1 year, we see no significant effect of MEH housing in nearby property values. But later we can see this negative effect. And this is consistent with disseminated effect. And the last thing that I want to show you is that we see that simultaneous construction of schools reduce the magnitude of the negative MEH effect. And which, excuse me, in this table, you can see that this is our baseline result. And in these columns, we use a measure for school availability. And in each of them, for example, in this column, with the dummy of school equals 1, if school to units ratio, if the number of schools that are constructed in that units, in that region, divided by the units that are delivered until that time in that region, is greater than 1 or is greater than 0.5, we turn this school dummy 1. And this is a measure of the school availability in that region. We see that when in more school availability regions, we can see less negative effect. And this means that disseminated effect is appeared in our context. To conclude, our results show large significant negative effects of public housing on neighboring property values. And house prices fall by 8 to 12% in the same neighborhood. And this effect is larger than previous studies in developed countries. And this is, I think, due to weaker government performance and differences in a developing country like Iran. This negative effect can be consistent with both supply and disseminated effect, but we try to show some evidence that disseminated effect also appear in our context. And we show 4 pieces of evidence that suggest that disseminated effect is also present. Our results pour cold water on the idea that rapid construction of concentrated affordable housing is a good solution to rising house prices. Precisely because it is very hard to supply the infrastructure required for keeping the amenities at pre-existing levels. Alternative idea is to gradually expand the stock of affordable houses in order to allow for the neighborhood infrastructure to adjust. Also, concentration of affordable housing units in a given area might be detrimental to the welfare of residents in the neighborhood. Thanks for your attention, and excuse me for the time.
Thank you very much, Said and Muhammad. This was an excellent paper again. Let me offer my quick comments, and then let's open the floor for discussion, which I hope would be more useful. So I've been quite busy over the last 2 weeks, so I wasn't able to type up my comments, but I would type up those comments and share them with the authors in the ERF. Let me begin by saying that all 3 papers, in a way, address issues that are important not just to the context that they are studying, but for the broader MENA region. The issue of capital flight, for example, is an important concern for developing countries, but also for the MENA countries. When we think about political connections, obviously, that's an overriding concern in the MENA region. So we want to learn what is the impact of these political connections on business-state relationship and broader outcomes. Again, very useful exercise. And finally, housing, which remains a huge issue in Gulf countries, huge issue in many other developing countries. Affordable housing is an important question to be explored. So in that sense, all 3 papers speak to issues that are important, substantively important for the region and developing countries at large. Now, turning specifically to methods, again, we see different types of methods. All 3 papers present us excellent display of different types of methods, ranging from panel data methods, ARDL, and the DID, the difference in differences analysis. And all 3 papers, in a way, are very careful in terms of setting out their methodology, dealing with identifying assumptions, and trying to address any potential concerns. So I think on both of these accounts, the 3 papers provide us a very satisfactory answer. Now, turning to specific comments for each paper, let me begin with the paper on capital flight. Now, that paper is effectively exploring the determinants of capital flight, and the focus really is on resource-scarce countries. These are sort of 3 countries: Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. The overall period is 1975 to 2019. And it explores different types of country characteristics, institutional quality, there's the fact of growth rate, inflation, but in particular, the emphasis is on exchange rate, right? And on asymmetric effects of exchange rate, so sort of real exchange rate appreciation versus depreciation. And it uses error correction models and autoregressive distributive lag models. A key area of interest is to look at the impact of the Arab Spring, and the paper does find a positive impact of Arab Spring on capital flight. And the effect of real exchange rate is particularly pronounced in Egypt and Tunisia. And in particular, it shows that, if there's a devaluation, it leads to more capital flight. Now, this is useful exercise in general. And the work, as I said, is methodologically careful. My main comment really is to think about, okay, why does this matter? And why do we focus on proximate determinants? I understand that the paper, Yasmin and her co-author talk about underlying institutional drivers, so sort of broader measure of institutional strength. But again, I think the question about capital flight has to be addressed in terms of sort of long durée institutional features that might drive those. So for example, one issue that's very relevant is the role of political instability, which the authors clearly try and address through the use of Arab Spring dummy. We know that the Arab Spring, for example, led to sort of more expropriation of assets by Benelli's assets. So obviously that would have an impact on capital flight as well. There's also been sort of corruption-related issues. You see this entire period in which you have a particular kind of business-state relationship emerging that led to forms of capital concentration that could feel threatened from this. Another important underlying institutional feature is sort of privatization. So the era of privatization, you see a lot of money coming in, but also going out. It would be, a lot of these countries signed IMF agreements. So it would be useful to look at how these impacts vary over time, right? And so almost like the last paper, present an estimation of this sort of short and long effect over time, so at least short effect over time. For example, in periods immediately following IMF programs, do you see capital flight or not? Because IMF program in Egypt, for example, were associated with a devaluation. And then the question really is to ask, what are the broader takeaways for the theoretical literature? I mean, my sense is that you pretty much confirm what we know about capital flight in this context, is sort of economic growth, inflation, real exchange rate. What is the sort of specific MENA characteristic that is in play here, apart from the role of the Arab Spring, which clearly is important. But again, it's the sort of discontinuous institutional change that is definitely going to increase capital flight. I think there's also a question about this whole debate on illicit financial flows, which run into trillions of dollars. And so the question is, can we disaggregate these capital outflows by destination? And that can tell us a great deal, right? So if there's a lot more capital flight taking place to France from both of these countries or other countries of Europe or United States, it might be revealing of the type of actors who are at play, the type of destinations where this money is going, or indeed the form of capital flight. Now that's might be tricky to get that sort of data, but I think it will be useful to ask. Another question is that whilst you focus on resource-rich countries, resource-poor countries, resource-rich countries are also very interesting to look at. We know that a lot of resource-rich countries in Middle East and North Africa have fixed exchange rate regimes. Now, of course, Algeria has more of a peg, sort of managed float. But still, by and large, you have a preference for fixed exchange rate regimes, including Jordan, to be honest. It's not resource-rich. Now, in this context, obviously, you don't look at the impact of exchange rate as such. So you can, in a sense, sort of control for the effect of exchange rate, but really look at the impact of other factors. And what would be useful is to see capital flight, not just in countries where political crisis is brewing, but in neighboring country, right? So that could have a very interesting impact because, Arab Spring, for example, created fears that might, be broadly transmittable to neighboring domains. One issue that I think at least concerns directly to the first two papers is sort of thinking of a shock, right? And so I think Adil does talk about sort of 2007-8 crisis, but if you have a shock that really allows you to distinguish these effects, that would be useful. But overall, it's a very interesting study, but I would really like to force you to sort of highlight what are the larger theoretical takeaways, what does the MENA experience tell us, and really digging a bit deeper into the institutional details that determine this relationship between these country characteristics and capital flight. Now, the second paper, again, is very interesting, and I think its contribution is really in developing a very fine-grained database on corporate connections, on ownership structures, and on political connections. Now, the question that is being asked is really about economic entrenchment, which is reflected in sort of indirect corporate ownership structures, politically connected firms, and pyramidal structures through which these firms tend to control. And Professor Adil really offered us a fixed effects regression and parent data methods to look at how the politically connected firms or firms with greater ownership structure, how do they perform? And the main performance measure that we have here is really the growth of assets. And there is some evidence that these effects are also different before and after 2008. The data comes from the Amman Stock Exchange, so you're really talking about the big listed firms. In terms of political connections, there's sort of two measures. There's one measure which really is the standard Faccio type measure, where if a shareholder is connected as a minister or has held an important position. And the second one, which I wasn't fully clear about, was the sort of government ownership, which I think is an interesting way to go about it. But I'll come to that in a minute. So these are the two sort of broader measures. And the findings are interesting. It's telling us that corporate sort of political ownership and ownership concentration are not always substitute for each other. You could have higher levels of asset sort of ownership concentration, but that does not necessarily mean that these are politically connected firms too. And in general, politically connected firms perform less well. Now, there are a few, but of course the paper is not complete. You don't have a concluding section which really brings everything together. So I had to just fiddle around a little bit with the tables and see if I'm understanding correctly. So please forgive me if I haven't fully captured the essence of what you're doing here. I think it would be useful to further ground the concept of economic entrenchment, right? So you offered us a definition that's very useful, but is it really entrenchment in terms of the nature and extent of linkages that they have with other shareholders or with the economy? Or entrenchment, it has a temporal dimension that they've been here for a long period of time. Does really economic entrenchment mean? In a way, it's implicit in everything what you're doing, because you're looking at how these owners are concentrated, their board interlocks, how different members of the family sit on multiple boards. So that's, in a sense, is a sort of an elaboration of entrenchment, but worth to ground it from the definition to the actual translation into that Jordanian context. Now, Jordan in and of itself is a very interesting country to study, because whilst we have a lot of data for Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, some more work on this, Jordan, we don't have enough evidence on politically connected firms. I think it would be useful to look at some kind of a shock over time that affects everyone similarly, right? And then the politically connected firms get more. That's always helpful. You cannot construct that shock, but empirically, it's a great thing to look for if you can find it. Now, you do talk about the 2007-8 global financial crisis as a shock, which is interesting, but that shock would probably affect the financial firms a lot more than the non-financial firms. One idea that we are exploring in another paper to be presented in a couple of weeks' time at the same conference is how post-global financial crisis, the bank concentration increased in monarchies in the Middle East, right, including Jordan. So you see growing bank concentration, which is to say more and more banking system assets are concentrated in a few banks. And that bank concentration increased after 2007-8 financial crisis. So it'll be interesting to see what's happening after 2007-8. Is really financial firms driving this impact or more generally? Also, I think it'd be useful to have more details about, you offered a very interesting detail about one firm, but it would be useful to see what is the extent of overlap between government ownership and political ownership, right? Because that tells us really about the mechanism of exchange. a big problem about the crony capitalism literature is that we know that there are some politically connected firms and they do bad or worse in certain situations. But of course, all political connections exist as part of a broader exchange. You exchange something for something, exchange favors. Now, is government ownership or buying of equity stakes is a form of a sort of cooperation that you see between these firms? So in other words, is it just a result of political connections or is it a measure of political connection? The fact that you have data on government ownership and indeed buying of equity is important. And that again is very useful. You could look at the timing of that. If there are certain times when the government is investing more in certain firms, right? Or if government is investing more in certain types of firms, is important. Because for any ruling coalition, there are different members, and the rents are passed to these members of the ruling coalition in proportion to their power. If there are certain families that are more crucial for government, you might see more government stake in those firms. Or it might be the case that now, for example, the relationship between the Jordanian monarchy and the tribes is slightly more constrained. You might see greater government ownership or government buying of assets of those firms that might placate those groups. So both in terms of their importance and both in terms of the timing, you might see how this government ownership reveals a little bit more about the nature of these linkages. Now, I understand a lot of that stuff is very difficult to address within the frames of an empirical analysis, econometric analysis. But believe me, I'm growingly getting fond of mixed method papers, particularly in countries like Middle East and North Africa, where data. I mean, it's great that Saeed and Mohammed were able to get such a fantastic data set that could allow them to do all those tests. It's not always possible in other MENA countries, where a good model is to start with sort of more standard econometric exercise, and where you get stuck, where you cannot go much farther, try and complement it with rich qualitative analysis, which can really bring more context to it and will become more relevant for global scholars because they can see the richness of that context and create more research designs for that as well. Okay, and I think another comment is about the dependent variable. You're obviously focusing on what is available, but it's not always clear to the reader what growth in assets would mean. What kinds of assets these are, what these growth in assets tell us. Why is this a measure that's important? You do talk a little bit about it, but I think it'd be useful. And also important to spell out the broader takeaways for the project. What are the ways in which it advances our understanding of the project? So it's more about streamlining. All right, I'm already taking quite a lot of time, so I must finish quickly, which is a shame because the third paper I really like as well, in part because I've also been using recently methods in differences analysis, so I have a lot of comments, but I'm sure we can touch base individually as well. Now, in this project, very clearly presented, obviously, is looking at a big public housing project, the MENA projects, and it's looking at using monthly data to see, monthly data on prices of MENA neighborhoods versus non-MENA neighborhoods. And then, of course, the timing, as Said, you clarified, it sort of varies according to when a project comes online. And doing that, you actually look at property values. You don't tell us much about where the price data comes from, so it'd be useful to have better description of, what I'm sure there's been some public websites that tell us about, prices of these neighborhoods or government records. It would be useful. But anyway, you then look at the impact, and you find that post construction, the prices in those neighborhoods do come down, and you offer us a great deal of evidence to that account. You test for parallel trends. You try and look at the identifying assumptions, carry out placebo tests. It's all very, very welcome. And I think it's a sort of model for DIT work to be done. Overall result is that concentrated affordable housing reduces prices in that area. It's sort of expected for affordable housing, But it's interesting that a lot of other countries you see concentrated housing schemes actually increasing the prices, but those are usually schemes that are more upper end of the scale, right? Now, it would be useful to know what is the, how these people can sell these houses. I mean, once these houses are built, are they able to sell them or not? Because that we need to learn a lot more about the market for housing, right, in those MENA regions. And your analysis obviously doesn't provide a lot of that. Now, many comments, but more by way of further elaborating. I think the real promising thing is that plot on levels differences. So the levels differences, if there is a difference between these two categories in levels, it's more likely that you will have a difference in differences too, right? And so that plot is very, very appealing for anyone. I would advise the farther you can, I mean, you're clearly including 60 or 66 months, right? So if you have data even before, it's always helpful to go as far back in time as possible, right? Obviously, there are data constraints, and we also don't know whether those effects hold, but it would be useful if those two things can be done. The other thing I would ask you to do is to sort of show us the plot of flexible specification, right? And so, which is basically monthly, time year fixed effects multiplied by the individual coefficient on the DID term, and just plot it over time. And it should show that prior to the construction, there is no impact, and after the construction, there is an impact. I really like the fact that you included the interactions between time period fixed effects, both months as well as the years with the cities. That's extremely useful, helps to allay any possible concern. Another is to actually have change the base year. If you're looking at parallel trends assumption, if you change the base year to 1 year prior to treatment, which will obviously differ across MENA neighborhoods, and then look at the impacts, it will provide us a good test of pre-trends, right? So if a MENA neighborhood is coming online, let's say in the year 2010, you take 2009 as the base year, and then re-estimate the coefficients, which will be, this flexible specification, which will give us a sense of the pre-period. Then you focus on the coefficients of the pre-period. There should not be much difference. That's another method. There's actually an excellent blog by David McKenzie at the World Bank, and that blog covers these different methods in DID developments, different latest developments in DID, which can be used to further supplement your DID analysis. Now, you do have these time fixed effects, but I think it would be useful to have locality-specific fixed effects. If you can collect data, I mean, I know you are controlling for city fixed effects, but there might be neighborhood-specific factors that might change differentially over time, right? So some neighborhoods may have different characteristics, and some of these characteristics, of course, difficult to get data on, but others, you might be able to get data on, especially using GIS, you're able to get data on these localities, right? So how far they are from water, how far they're from the nearest road, what's the latitude and longitude, right? All these factors are available. Many of them would be controlled in a way by these city fixed effects, but that's just city. But you're not just looking at the relationship between the neighborhood and the city, but with the neighborhood and the village too. Right. And so I think some of those factors you could again include as even fixed dimensions, pre-period multiplied by time period fixed effects. And all of this is to really address that there might be underlying factors that determine both where MENA neighborhoods are going to be built and whether those characteristics predispose those localities to have lower prices in the long run, right? And there might be factors that determine both the long-term price movements as well as the selection of these places from the neighborhood. So you need to bring in your paper a richer evidence, at least qualitative discussion about how do governments decide on which neighborhoods should these be built on, right? The discussion on mechanism is a bit underspecified, right? So mechanism is you're beginning to offer us heterogeneous impacts, but I wasn't too clear on what are the one or two key mechanisms. You know, you do provide evidence on both of those mechanisms, but are there others that you rule out, and so on and so forth? Do you have data on how people move away from housing? I mean, there are these new houses built. You might find, because their prices are falling, you might see other houses being sold more. So do you have data on the selling of houses in those neighborhoods? Because, you know, if there's a MENA neighborhood that's getting constructed, they're in the nearby areas, people might feel prices are going to decline, and they have anticipation effect, and therefore they sell more. And they sell more houses, that means the overall price in that region comes down, right? So that could be one of the mechanisms through which these prices are declining, because, you know, some areas become gentrified, these affordable housing areas might become degentrified, right? And that could have also an impact. And to close this discussion, obviously, availability of transportation is important. You talked about schools, but availability of transportation, because mobility is quite important for many of these people. To conclude the discussion, I think if house prices are falling, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because you are, you know, these households may not be able to sell their houses, but they have a place to live close to the city. So the general equilibrium effects of society could be very different, right? They are still able to live closer to those cities, and if there's transportation, they can travel, they can work. So price is one aspect of welfare. So your final conclusion, I thought, was very strong, because yes, I mean, prices are declining, but by providing affordable houses, there are broader general equilibrium effects that might run in the opposite direction. Anyway, we can go on, but I must stop here and give people an opportunity to ask questions. Are there any hands? I cannot see any hands. I cannot see any question being raised. So while people pose questions, maybe I ask all of you to sort of, you don't have to react to everything that I've said, but maybe, you know, any quick pointer that you want to make. Saeed or Yasmin, Adil.
May I start?
Please, please.
First of all, thanks again for your valuable comments. And let me just touch upon maybe a few of them. First of all, thank you for the shock. In fact, that's important, and that's basically how the previous research basically builds most of the results that are drawn as far as the impact of the political connections, especially when the evidence is a country-specific evidence. If I am to use some kind of shock, I will definitely search what could I use as a shock to everybody, not only for the politically connected firms, so that I would be able to compare politically connected to non-politically connected firms. But if it's going to be a shock that looks like a change in regime, so Jordan is a monarchy, and the King Abdullah now has been in power for the last 20 or 21 years or so. Before that, it was the late King Hussein. So that change basically goes way back into the past, and I don't really have enough data to compare before and after an event like that one. But still, it is worth to search for some kind of event, whether it was a change in the government, for example. That's one more thing I could try. So that's why I was thinking when you said a shock. That's one thing. The second thing is, as far as the government ownership, let me just clarify it for a while. In fact, Jordan went through a huge privatization stage since 1996 to up to 2004 or 6. So government does not really own much of the corporations, except some very few corporations that are basically in the natural resources, like the phosphate and potash corporations. Very few corporations. However, there's the Social Security Corporation, or what we call the Social Security Fund, which is now acting as an institutional shareholder, in fact. But the Social Security investments are basically managed by the government itself. So these are the ones that I called government corporations. I added to the corporations that are already managed by the government itself. Now, whether or not the corporations that are owned by the government are politically connected or not, that's not quite clear in the literature as well, because is it the government itself connected with itself, or is it the connections that other people seek with the government? So that's why I differentiated the government ownership or government-owned corporations from the politically connected corporations.
But do you have more? I mean, generally in the literature, politically connected firms are distinct from government-owned firms.
Right. Yes.
But it would be interesting to see what is the linkage between government-owned and politically owned. That would be more interesting question.
Yeah, I wrote that. In fact, thank you. That's one thing I should check. I wrote that. I said, thank you for that comment. That's one thing. And as far as the bank concentration, in fact, the banking industry in Jordan is in fact concentrated since a long time ago. The ownership of these corporations, of these banks, is concentrated, and the market of the banking industry is also very concentrated. There's not much competition in the banking industry itself. However, my sample does not include the bank corporations or financial institutions in general. It's only non-financial corporations. Banks as well are also owned by wealthy families, and many of the other non-financial corporations are also owned by that family, either directly by the same family that owns the bank or via that bank at the same time. So therefore, sometimes in terms of the data, it's not so easy to dissociate the ownership or to define whether the corporation is in fact, how the corporation is in fact is owned or not. That's why, by the way, related to one of your questions, as far as the pyramid structure or the indirect ownership, and whether or not the indirect ownership is in fact is a proxy for the political connection or not. Well, the literature says it does amplify the political connection of these corporations. Why? Because these individuals, they have, especially for a country with a small economy like Jordan, so if you have a few shareholders or few individuals who have their hands on a large stake of the economy, then they will definitely will have some kind of political power. So that's why the literature says it is a possible reason, or that's why the indirect control ownerships amplify the political connections. So in this paper, in fact, maybe it's not so clear, but I try to put all the whatever has to do with the ownership, whether it's direct or indirect, and whatever it has to do with the political connection, whether again it was a direct or indirect political connection. It's a very first attempt, so thank you for your comments again. They will certainly be taken into consideration, and thanks to the ERF once again. And I really appreciate your comments, because they are really useful. If I may, I'll just comment on the other two papers, if you don't mind, quickly.
Please, please.
As far as Yasmin's paper, well, I do agree with you that there might be some kind of institution differences across these countries, because the kind of analysis that she ran, the way that I understand what I understand is that she ran a separate analysis for each and every country. Is that what you did? I think that's what she did, a separate analysis for each country. Now, definitely when it's something, when it has to do with the capital flight, well, you mentioned maybe you should go after that capital and see whether that capital ends, the destination of that capital. Well, I think what would be maybe more interesting to look at what kind of capital is that? Is it a capital that is that belongs to the citizens, the country's citizens, or is it something like the foreign investment, for example? Maybe I think that's a little more interesting as far as the capital itself. Besides, if I were you, in fact, I would look at a shorter time period for each and every country and allow the cross-country differences, especially when it's a capital flight or something that can go over borders or cross borders between countries. I think what is more important, especially, is things that have to do with the tax system, for example. Maybe it's the tax system that has changed, or tax systems are different. Because I know at least recently, Egypt does have, in fact, a very favorable tax system, and maybe it's one of the best, maybe nowadays in the region. So I think these institutional differences are in fact important. As far as Saeed's paper, I'm sorry, Said's paper, I'm not quite sure whether your dummy variable MER is really proxying for the impact of the MER project, and I maybe it's the impact of the time period, although you do control for the time effects. I think I'm not sure what would be the alternative. I think it would be interesting to look for some other ways, maybe econometrically speaking, or if you at least interact that dummy variable with some kind of other maybe province or city-specific variable, just like the Professor Malik said. That's one thing. I would propose one more way if to compare. If you could create a match sample of a housing or a region where there is a mere housing versus a region where there is no such project. Maybe if you could find like a match sample.
There is, in fact, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, by the way, the DID setup allows you to really think about changes in this in these sort of regions and interacted with time. That does tell you that there's something different in these regions relative to others. And some of the things, I mean, the placebo tests also clarify to us that this is quite specific to it. But I think your suggestion, Adil, about matched samples is very interesting. In fact, if you look at David McKenzie's blog, he has very good discussion about DID on matched samples, because you have a very large database and the MER housing scheme runs into hundreds, right? So around 1,100 cities, right? It's a very big project. You can actually create matched samples of regions that are very similar in most characteristics, and then you do the DID on that. That's actually an excellent suggestion. Absolutely.
That will give you a direct, in fact, it will give you a direct test of the impact of MER. Maybe that would be
absolutely. So Yasmin has stepped out, but Said, would you like to quickly, Yasmin, we are going to Said, and then maybe if you have something to add. Said, you want to come?
Okay, thanks a lot. There were very, very good comments that, and I think we can improve our paper with both comments Dr. Malik and Dr. Pino tells us. It will be very great to send me your comments, Dr. Malik. If you can send them to me, it will be very great. But just one note that I want to mention is that we control for locality fixed effect. We don't control for city fixed effect. We control for postal region fixed effect, which is kind of a locality fixed effect. And for example, each city has about 30 postal region, and we control for that fixed effect. But another
so
other
do you also interacted with time?
Yes. No, with time, because we interact city with time. Because
city with time, not proposed. That's why it's important to have some spatial characteristics and interact with time. So it's useful to have postal fixed effects, but obviously these effects, their impact could be different over time. So to allow for that, think about some of those characteristics like distance to the nearest city, or latitude, longitude.
Yeah, we can use that.
Infrastructure, and then just interact with,
Yeah, that's very great. Thank you.
And also just to emphasize, I'll be sending my comments to Hoda, and she'll circulate. But this would also be, this whole session would be available on YouTube. So if you want to further engage with my comments, you can go to YouTube as well, and then just use the right point mark and look at your comments. Thank you.
Yes, I thank you for your comments. These are very helpful. We are still working on our paper, so we will definitely consider your comments. We will emphasize the institutional differences. It's a good point, I think. And we also wanted to include more countries in our analysis at the beginning. We wanted to include both oil importing and exporting countries, both resource-rich and resource-scarce countries, but we had some data problems. So we had to limit to our analysis for these 3 countries for the time being. I agree with Professor Malik that talking about the tax system, Professor Bino, sorry, talking about the tax system in different countries will be a good point. So we will try to include that analysis as well. Again, I thank you for listening, for your comments. I also thank to ERF organizing committee. Thanks, and hope to see you again.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for participation and for attending this session. And I should actually really end not as a tradition to say thank you, ERF, for bringing us together, but I do really mean it, that in this day and world where there's so few opportunities for MENA scholars to interact, to have a Jordanian scholar talking with a Turkish scholar on North Africa and a scholar from Iran, it is really no mean contribution. So I think it is really an excellent contribution by ERF and people who support the ERF. And we are extremely thankful for them for organizing this, and to the participants, and also for archiving these sessions. You know, one of the great things about these online webinars is that we can save, we have better archives than our previous conferences. Having said that, we do hope that next year we can all see you in person and have more social interactions, because obviously if we were together, we would have gone to a coffee, and the ERF offers excellent coffee and desserts, and then we would have continued our conversations about these papers there. But in the interim, I really enjoyed this, and thank you very much, Shireen, Ibrahim, Hoda, everyone. Shireen, would you like to offer any final comments, or we can just finish?
I just want to thank you in turn now for excellent moderation and for a very rich discussion and the discussants' comments. And it's been a very, very rich webinar. We'll be sharing the link. You know, it's registered on YouTube. It's already up and online and covered live. So we'll be sharing the link with you should you wish to share further, as Adil was saying. And you'll also be hearing from Hoda with Adil's comments, so that you can kindly incorporate that and share with us your revised version to include in the working papers. And thank you again, and very much looking forward to, as Adil was saying, to a proper coffee together. So hopefully, inshallah, next time, next year, inshallah.
Okay, great.
Thank
A
you very
good round
much.
of applause
Thank
for
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.